You've probably read his bio or heard some things about him from your teacher, but I'm just going to recap a few things. He obtained his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from Stanford. He has his Master's of Science in Symbolic and Heuristic Computation from Stanford, and he has his PhD from CMU in Artificial Intelligence. He has taught at Stanford. He has written several books. He started several companies. He's an entrepreneur. He has created and designed medical devices, holds several patents for hardware and software, and is currently the Director of New Projects at Google. Now, what you're going to love about Astro is that he's a thinker. And I think the reason why all of you here is because you like to think and you like to learn. Maybe you love to learn. So sit back and relax, thinkers unite, and enjoy the presentation. Let's give him a warm Pittsburgh welcome.
So I know how you guys feel. More than you think. Because I was in that seat, metaphorically, 22 years ago. And I remember feeling like it ought to be possible to change the world. I know you guys feel that. But you're also kind of worried that the world's just going to be a little more complicated than it seems, that it'll get in your way somehow, it'll disappoint you, it'll be harder to change the world, or you won't get to. But you have that feeling, right? It's not really because you're smarter that you're in these seats. It's because you have that feeling that you're in these seats. And that's really important. So that's actually what I'm going to talk to you about today. I have some good news and some bad news for you guys. So show of hands, who wants the good news first? Who likes their good news first? Bad news first. By the way, I happen to agree, bad news first. It's like saving the icing for last. So the bad news is that most of what you really need to know, you haven't started learning yet. And schools are terribly set up to teach you those things. Oh well. The good news is, you collectively are going to get to change the world. That's pretty awesome. It'll take 20 or 30 years, but I guarantee you that you collectively will get to change the world, and a few of you will be running the world 30 years from now. I guarantee that too. But it won't be the smartest of you. It's going to be the ones of you that are the most fierce, the most passionate, and the most adaptable. And you kind of know that a little bit, and yet it's not really what you're taught. It's not how you spend your days. You don't go to fierceness class. Unless you count high school's fierceness class, which maybe we ought to, I guess. So, I know it says the future of intelligent technology, and let's all be thinkers today, but you know what? I'm not going to talk about that. You guys, this is your time, so at any point when you're ready, you just start interrupting me, because this really is your time, and I'm happy to take questions. But until you start interrupting me, I'm going to tell myself 22 years ago, when I was sitting in those seats, what I wish I had heard, and what, to some extent, I did get told, and I really appreciate it. And the reason I'm here is because I'm paying it forward. I can't pay it back to the people who did it to me. So, the problems that you're going to encounter in your life are mostly emotional problems. They're not intellectual problems. Let me give you an example. Let's say that having a great idea, a big idea, a change the world idea, is like 1 unit of effort. It's pretty cool to have a change the world idea moment, right? If that's 1 unit of effort, making the prototype is like 10 units of effort. It's so much more than having the idea. You guys have probably had some experience with that, right? If making the prototype is 10 units of effort, making it so it actually works, so it could survive contact with the real world, that's like 100 units of effort, right? There's like the, don't touch it or it'll fall apart kind of prototype, and then there's the, like, it actually does what it's supposed to do under, like, real world conditions. If that's 100 units of effort, then making it into a product that is something that people would actually use and actually want is about 10 times harder again. We're at 1,000 units of effort now to make something that people would actually want and that they could actually use in the real world. Getting them to pay for it, so we're at 1,000, right? Getting them to pay for that product or service is another factor of 10 harder. We're at 10,000 units of effort, and that is still not really the problem. In any organization, whether it's for-profit or non-for-profit, no matter what you want to do, 90% of what's hard is the people. It's working with the people who you manage, working with the people who are your peers, helping to manage the people above you so that they know how to manage you. That's 90% of the challenge. 100,000 units of effort. And that first 1 unit of effort was the big idea. And the reality is we get told when we're 17 years old that it's all about having the big ideas and knowing how to move the symbols around to like check that the big idea is good. But that's just not where the hard stuff is. I'll give you some more examples that I wish I had known earlier. I'm telling you guys this because I think you're the future of intelligent technology. And I'm happy to rant to you guys about some of the technology issues of the day and that I see coming in the future. But the stuff that I'm telling you is what I'm more passionate about, and I'm more convinced that it's what will change your life than me telling you robotics, blah, 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 blah. So, there's a couplet from Goethe's Faust, which was written in German, obviously. How many of you guys know Goethe's couplet? That's all right, I'm not going to test you. It wasn't like that kind of thing, you know it. So there's a long version which is incorrectly ascribed to Goethe, which was written by a mountain climber in the 1940s, the end of which, if you can Google this afterwards, you'll find this sort of 10-line thing. It's totally worth reading. I find it to be one of the main mantras of my life. But the actual couplet from Goethe, the last 2 lines of this thing from the mountain climber, are, whatever you can do or believe you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. The genius, the power, and the magic, this couplet is telling us, and I found this to be really profoundly true, they don't come from how smart you are, or necessarily from the friends or connections that you have. They come from the fact that you got to that magical moment where you said, I'm going to do it. I don't care what anyone says. I'm going to do it. I don't care how hard it gets. I'm going to do it. Because as soon as you decide that, things get easier. You don't have to spend all your time stressing about whether you're going to do it or not. You don't have to spend any time arguing with people about whether you should do it or not. Because you can just say, I'm doing it. I don't care. Things get so much easier, so much more surprisingly powerful when you make that decision. That's an example of something that you may or may not have experienced in your life yet. I sort of had when I was 17, but I didn't have that nugget. I hadn't crystallized it in a way that I could implement it in the rest of my life. Because until you decide that, everything will get in your way. And this doesn't matter whether it's sports, whether it's getting into a college, whether it's a romantic relationship. This is just a true fact about the world. And to the extent you can internalize it and make it how you live your life, I'm sorry to sound like Yoda, but there is no try. Right? You do it or you don't do it. That's what the couple's telling us. I'll give you another example. How many of you have done like theater improv? Anyone? Some of you? So one of the main games in theater improv is the and but game. Has anyone here played the and but sort of warm up? All right. So it's really instructive, even just in the context of theater, to have this experience, but I think there's a much bigger message also. When you sit with a group of people on a stage, just to warm up, and you try the following experiment. Someone says a sentence or two, like of a story, and then the next person says, but, and then they have to continue. The story dies very quickly. There's just nothing to say. It doesn't go anywhere. You should try it sometime. Just pick 5 friends, just try telling a story, 3 sentences, and you pass it to the next person, they say bye. And then they keep talking. You can't do it. Now try it where the next person says and instead of but. It's like magic. All of a sudden, things get funnier, the story keeps going. It turns out that when you block, you're not just blocking the other person, which is bad enough, but you're actually blocking yourself in ways you don't realize. It makes it harder to continue. It makes it in anything in life. So that's theater improv. But this sort of secret, one of these little secrets of life is that everything is like that. I have a friend who actually went an entire month without saying the word but, and is so into it that he now just doesn't do it anymore. And I really admire that. I've become sort of a fan of this issue for this exact reason. There's something important about saying and to other people before you start talking. If they say something stupid, you can say, that's interesting, and I would do it differently. You don't have to agree with what everyone says. But when you say, I hear you, I'm taking you seriously, you're going forward from where they are instead of trying to put on the brakes and go in a different direction. And I think you will find, if you actually experiment with that you get to a very different place. And again, this is just as true if you're doing science, or if you're trying to get a job, if you're trying to get into college, in a romantic relationship, any of these things. You guys know I'm just going to keep going like this till somebody asks a question. That's the game here, right? I'll tell you a story about questions. This is the first time in 12 years I was tempted to do this. I got asked to give a talk at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. This is about 11 years ago. It was the only place, at least at the time, that you could get a master's in, or a PhD in national security. So, what am I going to talk to these people about? Like, you had to be at least a colonel to even become a student at this college. I was 29 at the time. I felt seriously underqualified to talk to this group. So, as a total punt, I went in. It was an hour-and-a-half long talk, and I just had one slide. At the time, slides were in PowerPoint. This is pre-PowerPoint, if you can imagine that. So it was these transparency overheads, but you could print on them on the printer. So I printed in huge letters, "Any questions?" And I put that up on the overhead, and I just stood there. And it took them about a minute to figure out I was serious. And we had a great 90 minutes, and they came away with the mistaken impression that I had given them a great talk, when in fact I completely avoided having to give them a great talk by just having them tell me what they wanted to hear. It's okay, so I'm brave enough, I'm just going to keep ranting at you about the things I wish I'd heard, but it is actually your job to start asking questions. Yes?
What do you specifically do on a daily basis for Google?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, but first, cool points for asking the first question. So I can't say a lot about what I do at Google, but I can tell you a little bit about what I've done and how that may translate into how I spend my time at Google. So my interest, as I've built companies over the long run, has been how to create organizations that create innovation. So the first business that I ran was an advanced development consultancy. And some of the time we were going out to large multinationals, helping them find their sort of basic technologies that they had in their labs and reimagining what they could do with that technology. But we were also spinning off a number of businesses in the background. That was sort of the other thing that our business did. And I really enjoyed that process of being innovative full-time and trying to codify and organize a group to be reliably innovative. The third business that we spun off was a wearable body monitoring business that is still around. Many of you may know of it. It's in the area. It's called Body Media. Scott Bemke, who's in the background there, still works there. I'm on the board of directors still. I was just at a board meeting yesterday. And the company is a really exceptional company in a lot of ways. I think it would not be unfair to say, though, that during my tenure as CEO, I made up for imperfect execution by pushing the organization fairly effectively to do a lot of innovative things and to build a platform that could support a lot of innovation. We actually, in the background, myself and a few other people started an intellectual property holding company, which was really about recognizing innovation and creating new innovation in the patent space. The hedge fund that I was just fairly recently running in San Francisco is actually working on building a software factory for ideas. So the question is, how do you get a machine, a computer, to innovate? And in the very broad sense, that's just not doable right now. It has for a long time been very doable if you narrowly constrain the problem enough. And myself and the co-founders of this hedge fund decided that we were just getting to the place where you could ask that generally in the hedge fund space, finding statistical arbitrage, structural arbitrage, and information arbitrage opportunities in trading the public markets and various assets. And so we built that, and again, it was sort of, how do you regularize innovation? So I'm now doing things at Google that I can't talk specifically about, but I hope that what I'm bringing to Google is ideas about how to make an organization that can generate a lot of innovation and productive innovation over time. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes?
How do you create an effective organization that does innovate change, and how do you overcome the midlife and late-life magnetism?
Do you mean my personal midlife and late-life magnetism? Or, no, you mean for the organization, right? So, that's a great question. That sort of, in a way, is the ultimate question. There are lots of things that one can do. In companies, you can do things like say specifically that you value innovation. You'd be surprised, but many companies value the fact, or think they value the fact, that they're innovative. But that's not the same as valuing the process of innovation or spending the energy on innovation. Because spending the energy on innovation really means giving people the room to take risks and the room to fail and grading them on the quality of the chance they took rather than the outcome. And that's a way of thinking that many organizations are not very good at. So they can, right at the beginning, when they have nothing to lose, many companies will take these big risks because if it doesn't work out, nobody noticed. Right? You didn't have any investors' money yet, and it was like this cool idea. No, it turns out it wasn't a cool idea, so you just stop. But once you get going and you're making money, now it looks like you have something to lose. And you stop, or many companies stop doing that. So I think the first step along the process is to say explicitly, we intend not just to be innovative, but to innovate and to do specific things. I was giving an example just now about promoting good risk-taking and judging people on the quality of the choices they make when they take those risks rather than the outcomes. So that's an example. Having a lot of diversity in an organization makes a huge difference. If you have everybody at your organization thinking like you think, then you're just going to be less innovative. Your innovations will spiral in these tiny little spirals. It's not very worthwhile. So the organizations that are really committed to innovation commit to bringing in new people, to bringing in people who are very different from the people who are already there. They commit to giving money to do innovation. It's painful because, especially when times are tough, the easiest thing to not do is innovate because it doesn't cost you anything right now. it's ruining your business 5 years from now, but it doesn't cost you anything right now. And one of the reasons I'm at Google is because Google clearly believes in innovation and does a lot of investment in innovation. And I think that that's a really strong thing. There are different kinds of innovation too. So for example, Microsoft Research innovates, but they innovate in a very academic way, and I don't mean that in as negative a way as one could take it, but I mean they literally promote people doing basic thinking about the world and writing papers about that. And that's, of course, adds value to the world. That's one way of being innovative. That's not my personal style. That's part of why, for example, I'm not at Microsoft. I'm more interested in having impact on the world. And it's not that by writing a paper you can't have impact on the world, but when there's not that moment of so what, in the middle of the innovation process, if you're allowed to just think of things because they interest you, you get this sort of random walk, and this is what, unfortunately, I think happens in a lot of academia, you get this sort of random walk in intellectual space that some people are good at guiding themselves through, and many aren't. And very occasionally you get the 6 standard deviation amazing idea that pops out. It's very hard to get out of industry. In industry, you often get these 1 standard deviation improvements because you can't afford to take, or they believe that you can't afford to take bigger risks and look farther out. I think it's possible, and great organizations are, at least for periods of time, great at doing this, at shooting for like 3 standard deviation, maybe 4 standard deviation changes in the world. And you can do that by applying so what in the research process. I'm actually crazy about the term research. I much prefer to think of them as moonshots. So when you think about something like, we're going to put a man on the moon, that doesn't sound like a research project. That sounds like someone could die if it doesn't go wrong. That sounds like a lot of money's going to be spent, and it's incredibly crisp what we're going to do. Now, in fact, an incredible amount of research and basic science, engineering that had never been done before, but also basic science had to be done, and industries, several whole industries spun out of the process of trying to put the first man on the moon. But I don't think it would have happened, and certainly wouldn't have happened with the same quality or with as little money as was actually spent on it. If someone had said, let's research rocket technology. So it matters how you ask the question too, and I think there's incredible value in making moonshots rather than calling it or thinking of innovation as research. But again, that depends on where you are. Academia is going to put it one way, and I've just put it a somewhat different way. Yes?
You said that whenever you have an idea, it's like 1 unit of effort, and then like doing all the stuff with it to like get it in the market and get people to pay for it is like increasing by like factors of 10, like in the amount of effort. Like how do you address, like how do you go about doing that? Like what's like a time frame for that to happen, or like what can you do to like speed it up?
To speed up having the idea, or you mean from the moment you have the idea to getting it into the market to have the impact actually crystallize?
Yeah, like to make the idea happen.
I mean, well, so this is the hard part, right? If I could, and I will give you some answer, I'm not going to dodge the question, but this is my point. I can't even tell you how to do the 1 unit of effort, having the idea. I have some tricks I could give you, but even there it's pretty hard, and they're just people who are better at it than others. But doing the 100,000 unit problem, like getting an organization to do the right things, that's the magic, that's the secret. Like, this is why if you go to Barnes & Noble or Borders right now, like a quarter of the books are on how to do this, basically. They go by different names, but like all the ones in the front that they're trying to get you to buy for Christmas time that are like 1-word titles, like blink and click and sway and things like that, they're all basically about trying to help people figure out how not to suck at organization building, essentially. So there's some really basic things like don't be mean to each other, right? Don't hire jerks. Like that right there gets you to like the 50% bar, and you'd be shocked how many people don't either know that basic rule, or many of them think they know that rule but just totally don't follow it. Because this is the way it sounds. Oh yeah, we don't hire jerks. And then it's like, Bob shows up, and Bob's an amazing salesman. And we're like, yeah, Bob's a little rough around the edges, but Bob's gonna get it done for us, right? And then all of a sudden you have your first jerk. And guess who he's gonna hire? He's gonna hire these people who they're really gonna deliver, right? It's Sally and Susie, but they're jerks too. Because if they weren't jerks, why would they be reporting to Bob or have come to work for Bob, right? And then, like, soon enough, your organization is filled up with jerks, and then the good people start leaving, so like, I don't want to be around the jerks, right? So you're the first ones who would be off the ship, right? So like, I don't need this. And then the organization becomes a B- organization instead of an A+ organization. So that's an example of a rule which is easy to say and surprisingly hard to implement. Something that helps a lot is accountability. Most of us have a hard time with conflict because we think that conflict is like yelling and screaming, right? It's like, I don't want to see my mom and dad fight, and you end up feeling like fighting is a failure. In fact, conflict is critical to an organization, to any human relationship, and the most complex human relationship is when a big group of people try to do something hard together, right? And training an organization to have productive conflict, right, is the difference between you're an idiot and let me help you understand why your idea isn't working for me. Right? Because you're an idiot, whatever I say afterwards, you stop listening to me. We're not going to get anywhere for today, right? But if I tell you, look, that's solving your problem, but it's actually making a problem for me much worse, and the organization's not going to get what it wants if you do what you're currently doing. How about we do something different and then we could both win, right? It's easy to say that, but training an organization to have that kind of conflict is really critical to making progress. Vision is important. And I don't mean like big vision, like visionary kind of stuff. I mean having a specific idea, like this moonshot. Can you imagine if Kennedy had made a speech, 2 months later, and was like, you know what, let's put a man on Mars instead. And then like a year later, it's like, wait, you know what, Venus would be even better. That's not productive. You need somebody to say, this is what we're gonna do, and a lot of how we're going to try to do it may change because we're going to learn about the world. But we're not going to change our vision all the time, because if we change our vision all the time, then I'm like, we're going to Mars, and everyone's like running this way, right? And then we're like, no, we're going to Venus, and everybody starts running this way. And you know where we get after like 5 years? We're just right where we started. And I know lots of really, really bright people who are given teams to manage, and they get absolutely nowhere. Not because they don't have good ideas, because they have too many good ideas. And so their people come in every Monday, and they're like, okay, Sarah, what should I do today? And Sarah's like, oh, how about this, and this, and this? Not paying attention to the fact that she had this whole separate list for them the previous Monday. And then they're like, in squeaky little voices, they say, oh, what about the list you gave me last week? And Sarah's like, no, these ideas are better. Right? So you're like, okay, Sarah's really bright, she's nice, I guess I should do her ideas, right? You spend a grand total of 5 days working on Sarah's ideas, and the next Monday she's going to give you a new list. You don't make any progress, right? This is another example where organizations that make good progress need to have a culture of not changing their vision, even if they change how they do it, right? Yes?
In the eye of the public, what do you think that Google does differently from other corporations to fulfill their motto, don't be evil?
That's a great question. So let me be specific. I don't speak for Google, number one. And number two, I've only been at Google for 4 months. But I can definitely tell you that I've been very pleasantly surprised at how active that motto is within Google. That phrase comes up every single day. It's not lip service that they pump externally. That's really a basic way that people decide what to do and what not to do. It's not the only way that people decide what to do and not to do at Google, but it certainly comes up, and people are incredibly serious there of having a positive impact on the world. Now, of course, reasonable people can disagree about this, but the most important thing that they do is that there is a culture there that promotes and rewards people saying that, and that vigorously punishes people who stray off the path. So that combination is sort of hard to get right. And of course, it plays out in very different ways. So, Google's not building new tanks, right? Yeah, you saw self-driving cars in the press recently, right? They're not making tanks, right? That's just like a basic thing. It's not even necessarily evil to help the U.S. military. Reasonable people could disagree about that, but it's not necessarily evil. But that's enough in the gray area Google's just not interested in, right? And on a lot of those fronts, there's so many things to do that many companies, Google is one of them, can just choose only to act in those spaces in which it's clearly going to help the world. And then, to the best of its abilities, decide what is in the best interests of its users. So, and I don't know, I don't think there's a magic answer to that, but they do take it really seriously. And that's one of the really good things about being there for me. Yes?
Do you mind describing the process that you took to get your first patent?
My first patent. Yeah, I'm not sure that that'll be the most instructive, but I guess I'll tell you that. So the patent process, I'm going to rant about the patent process for a second, so that there's something more educational than just hearing about how I did a bad job when I was 26 years old or whatever. So the patent process comes from a really good basic idea. The basic idea is that if you have a situation in which individuals and companies do research, come up with a good idea, and that it's easy to steal those ideas, the worst case scenario is that nobody does any research and progress doesn't happen. That's pretty bad. The best case scenario under those circumstances is that people keep everything really secret to themselves, right? And that kind of secrecy also impedes progress in the long run. So the idea is, what if we gave a government-granted monopoly on the secrets? We're going to make, we, the government, will make you a deal. If you tell everyone your idea, then for a period of time, sort of ballpark 17, 20 years, sort of depends on a number of things, you can have a monopoly on your specific idea, however broad or specifically, you can justify that you thought of it first and that you reduce it to practice, etc. And in exchange, when the 20 years is up, then everyone gets to use it for free. That seems like a reasonable deal. Now the problem is, the law being what it is, it's incredibly easy to game the system. And a lot of people put more energy into gaming the system than they do into actually inventing things. So the system has been seriously hijacked. But that doesn't mean that the idea, the basic idea, is bad, or that there's a better idea that we could switch to. People have made proposals, some of them are interesting, I don't think any of them are super compelling, and the patent system, as we know it, is not going to be meaningfully changed in the near future, because there's too much that's riding on that right now. So the process I went through was, I was working on my thesis, it was about half done, I was at Carnegie Mellon. This was computer science, artificial intelligence, specifically it was machine learning. I had some specific ideas. I submitted an invention disclosure form to the Technology Transfer Office at Carnegie Mellon, and they said that it was worth getting a patent on. In retrospect, I don't know what possessed me to give it to them, or what possessed them to say that. And I'm not even necessarily saying they were wrong, I'm just saying, I don't know on what basis they judged that. But anyway, they did, and so, then they did the drafting work, but they, sort of like an interviewing process, if you don't know how to write a patent, then they can interview you, try to extract your knowledge, write it up in a way that sort of satisfies the rules of the patent office, and got filed. There's a period of prosecution during which the patent office, after a long break, calls you back and says, nah, I don't really like, some of how you describe things, or more importantly, I don't like what you're claiming in light of what you described. I want you to claim less or claim it differently if you want me to allow this, and some bickering and, horse trading goes on, and eventually, hopefully, you get some claims and they're issued, and actually the process can continue even after that. But in fact, because I didn't know what I was doing at the time, we got essentially all of the claims we asked for. I guess, like in any negotiation, if you get everything you asked for, you probably didn't ask for enough. And we were like, okay, thanks. And that was just it. right? And it turns out there's more we could have done, but we didn't. I've learned a lot since then, and there are lots of better ways of driving innovation, about helping engineers and scientists think about the patenting process. Most scientists and engineers hate the patenting process. They believe that it takes them away from what they otherwise should be doing because they don't understand it. In the same way that if you tried to get a patent lawyer to go write code, they would resist like crazy because it's a language they don't speak, they feel inept, and they're just like, I get paid so much more to do something that I'm good at. But in fact, if with relatively little training, you can show scientists and engineers how to think about the patenting process as an engineering problem and as a creativity problem, which is what engineers and scientists are good at, and once you get them to understand the basic building blocks, they can get much more engaged in it. Yes?
Students here who are considered engineers in medicine, engineering, computers, where are they most likely to encounter artificial intelligence? What are most likely the hotbeds out there that they'll need to be educated?
I'm going to read that question back to you because I want to make sure I get it right. I think this is a very broad and interesting question. But is your question, in which of these domains is artificial intelligence going to play the biggest role?
Or where will they find it in each of those domains?
So I think that's a totally legitimate question. And so saying the following is not me saying that that was the wrong question, but surprisingly, that's the wrong question in the sense that it would be a little like 20 years ago saying, in which business would you find the internet? It turns out the internet isn't a business. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. It's just part of the substrate upon which all organizations are now built and operate. And in the same way, artificial intelligence is already, to a shocking degree, I don't know the extent to which you guys realize, when you land in an airplane, mostly that's the computer landing the airplane. And they're already driving, the BART in San Francisco and lots of other things. They're active in medicine, in finance, in everything. So it is not only already there, but increasingly it's the substrate where, I'm going to take as an example, and this is not the only part of artificial intelligence, but because I think it's one of the most exciting parts and because it's sort of closest to my heart, because it's what I've spent a lot of time in, machine learning, getting computers to learn from experience, is increasingly something that everybody needs to know, every organization needs to know, not every individual in the organization needs to know, because it's like saying, are we going to need computers? That question 20 years ago, was like, maybe we could get away without computers, but in retrospect we could see everybody needs computers. And in the same way, there's so many problems that are better solved. And machine learning goes by lots of different names, and you can make it sound really fancy if you want it to, but basically it's kind of like counting. You just count up what's happened in the past, and you make certain assumptions about the way the future is going to be like the past, and you do the things that if, the future is like the past, then it'll work out well for you. Obviously, there's a lot of details, but that's basically what it works out to. And there are a lot of things where people have historically done the counting, or taken just raw guesses about how to behave, and it's just more effective if you count, or you actually let the computer count. So I think, I wouldn't put a bet that artificial intelligence will be important here and not important there. I don't see any reason to believe, even in the arts, for example, that it won't be an important part of how people in the arts interact with their tools 20 years from now. And in fact, probably the really exciting and avant-garde things that are being done in the arts 20 years from now will be done hand in hand with computers. Let me give you a sort of funny example about that. So, you guys all remember 1997, Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, the IBM computer that was playing chess against him. So, since then, there have been these ongoing questions about, which are better, humans and computers, and that's sort of this, computers have just kept getting better and humans haven't. So there's not really a contest anymore, like we wouldn't even bother having such a contest today. And you can extrapolate that into all other human endeavors eventually, because computers are still getting better fast, and we're getting better very slowly and fast. But one of the things that sort of emerged is how these things can be orchestrated. So there was a freestyle competition in 2005 that Kasparov wrote about in his book, I think last year. And in the freestyle competition, any computer could play, any person could play, and any combination of people and computers could play. So if you think about the matrix of super smart people versus relatively less strong people with respect to their ability to play chess, and then the greatest computer programs that you could get your hands on versus relatively weaker computer programs with respect to playing chess. And let's not even worry about whether any one computer or human is playing by themselves, but assume they're going to be orchestrated. Presumably, we would put our bets on the best human chess players with the best computer chess players. And then if we had to place some more bets, we would place our other two bets in these two categories, right? If this was the best, and the best was sort of weak humans, strong computers, or strong humans, weak computers. But we wouldn't put any of our money on weak people with weak computers. And yet that box, it was someone clearly in that box who won the competition. And the analysis afterwards was that it was the orchestration of the two, that it was their way of calling back and forth. There was 3 people with 3 laptops with totally mediocre chess programs. But it was an innovative way of having the 3 people working back and forth with their program and back and forth across these pairs of a person and a computer that was so much better a process than other people had that they crushed everybody else. And I think that that's really inspiring to me about the way the world is going to be, that the things in the future that are likely to end up being the big success stories are not super smart people, nor computers acting entirely by themselves, but the right ways for us to interact with computers, using them as better and better levers for our minds. Does that answer your question? All right, just so following up from what we were talking about before, another little side rant. Chess is cool, and there are things that you can learn from chess. It's a metaphor which is thick in Western culture. But there's a game I believe you can learn more from, which is Go. How many people have played Go?
Oh yeah.
So I think Go is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, computers can crush people at chess. They cannot crush people at Go. That, just by itself, is a reason to be interested in Go, because there must be something interesting going on there. And there's some technical reasons why that's true, but there are some reasons that aren't fully understood about why that's true, too. For those of you who haven't played, it sort of feels to me like competition finger painting. But there are things that Go teaches you that are not, in my experience, what chess teaches you. So chess, in order to be really great at chess, you have to learn a lot of facts and these threads that people have done before. And they have names. And there's only like this middle chunk of the game, which is really kind of open, and a lot of it at the beginning and the end is very prescribed. There's coolness to chess, and I like that you can fetishize the pieces. But it's very Western, in a way. All this kind of learning and thinking. Go is, like I said, it's more like competition finger painting, at least for me. And it teaches you much harder things. So what happens is you get into a little skirmish in one part of the board. And always, especially early on in the game, what novices will do is they will participate in the skirmish. If I play here, then you're going to play here too. Because you're like, oh wait, because if I don't do that, then I'm going to lose. Nope. The right way to play is constantly to look at the entire board and say, what is the most important place I could move? And there are different ways to learn that skill. Like you could think, one of the things I used when I was training myself to play Go, where would I be most upset if you play? And I'm going to play there first. And it turns out it's a totally different place than if I just let myself get sucked into these little moments. Because Go is this very distributed game and everything can touch everything else, it all matters, but there are lots of moments where you have to say, you know what, those pieces of mine that I've been fighting to save, if I give up right now, it's my turn to move, and having it be my turn, my advantage, I have the the opportunity to either try to save them or by playing somewhere else. I'm going to lose them if my opponent decides to take those pieces. But in doing that, I get the advantage somewhere else and I get to redefine the momentum of the game. That's the way life actually is those choices about what not to do or what strategy is. Strategy is not what you're going to do. Strategy is a long list of things you're determined not to do. That's what makes strategy hard, because we don't want to have to make a list of what we're not going to do. So anyway, for those of you who don't play Go, I encourage you looking into it. Yes?
What kind of a student were you in high school?
I was a little bit obnoxious, honestly. Yeah, so thank you. The question was, what kind of a student was I in high school? I was a good student. We had a graduating class of about 950 people, and I was in the top 10, so it's not like I didn't get good grades. I was very grumpy. I think you guys are very lucky to have the quality of teachers you have, and I guess I'm being really lame because I had amazing teachers now when I look back on it. But I still ended up feeling like they had a lot of authority over me, and I just had a real problem with authority, honestly. And I was underproductive about how I engaged them, and I could have gotten more out of them if I did it. I also was very competitive when I was in high school, and I really missed the boat on that. And luckily for me, I think I switched my attitude just as I was going to Stanford. And this is one of the best decisions I've made my entire life. On my way into Stanford, I said, 4.0 is not the best grade you can get. I want a GPA of 3.5. And to get a GPA of 3.6 is as much of a failure for me as getting a grade point of 3.4. Because there's so many other things I could do with my life, and being smart is not actually what's most important. And I've just become more and more convinced of that over time. And there's different kinds of smart, too. And I got, because I was determined to get a GPA of 3.5 instead of a GPA of 4.0, I ended up doing a lot of things I would not otherwise have done if I'd still been fixated on a GPA of 4.0. So I'm really glad I made that decision. So the high school part, I think, did not work well for me, but that part did work better. I also made a switch that's related to this question of innovation, which I think was a really big change for me as a student and later as a professional. I moved from grading myself on my accomplishments. You know, like, I'm not wired to not beat myself up, and I know, because I was in your chairs. Most of you are wired very heavily to beat yourself up. That's just the way it is. It's okay. But I have a secret for you. Well, you can't undo that, because that's like your inner parent, right? And you're just not going to shake that. It's just too late. But you can change the rules. What you can do is you can actually say, I'm going to give myself just as hard a time, but on the first derivative. I'm going to grade myself on how hard I try, on the quality of the risks that I take, of how proud I am afterwards of my behaviors, on the first derivative. If I'm learning a lot, so that no matter how many mistakes I make, I think I'm never going to make that mistake again, and you really catalog them and you don't make those mistakes again, and that is how you grade yourself, and you're really harsh about that, you can still be really mean to yourself. Really push yourself hard. And the thing about grading yourself on your accomplishments is you can't control the world. You can control some of the world, but you can't really control the world. Luck is very involved. And it turns out that being successful is mostly about taking a lot of shots, about taking little bets, and then only amplifying the bigger bets where the little bet worked out. So if you're going to beat yourself up once per failure, you're going to do a lot of beating yourself up. It's just exhausting. Whereas if you try really hard and it doesn't work out, and you're like, good job, to yourself. And so I sort of made that transition where I didn't get that in high school, but I did sometime during Stanford, and so I was a much better student at Stanford. Just as another aside, there's a note-taking culture which I think starts in high school and gets really kind of crazy extreme when you're in college. And everybody, go into like any hard class in college, and people are scribbling like this the whole time. And I asked people, I did this in college, I said, do you remember what the person is saying? And they're like, no, that's why I'm writing it down. I think, isn't it backwards? So I just tried not taking notes, and I discovered that if you actually listen to them, put down your pen, just listen. Because what actually causes you to have things stick in your brain, at the end of the day, it's the emotional stuff. It's not the intellectual stuff. I'll give you an example in just a second. I guarantee you will stick in your brain. It's something you've been taught before, but none of you could rederive it for me. It's a math thing. But you'll all be able to rederive it afterwards. Because you're listening, because you're not writing it down, and because I'm going to show it to you in a different way. But that was a big epiphany for me, that life is about actually focusing, being mindful in the moment, and you can hardly be less mindful than taking notes. I just personally don't believe in taking notes. It's sort of like walking around the Louvre like this with a video camera. I'm looking at the art. No, you're not looking at the art. Your video camera's looking at the art. And later, your best case scenario is that you're going to, on your home TV, look at the art which you could have seen filmed better by somebody else. I don't understand it. So, all right, real quick. How many people here know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared? All right. Woo. How many people feel that they can come up here and derive why a squared plus b squared equals c squared? All right, I got a brave hand or two. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you do it. Partly because I'm not sure it will work, partly because it might take some time, and partly because I missed my opportunity to prove my point. But good for you for raising your hand. All right, so this is sort of another basic, oh God, it's not a square. It's not going to go well if I can't even make a square. All right, so let's just have, art was obviously not one of the things that I practiced. So if we call this A, and this B, and this C, okay? So three sides of a triangle, and this is C squared, right? You can just rearrange this square so that this is A squared, you just, by construction, this is B squared, and what you get, right, so this is A, this is B, this is C, you get 4 of these triangles, 1, 2, 3, 4, A squared, B squared, you get the 4 triangles, you subtract them out, equals C squared, right? There you go. It turns out that most of how we're taught is not like that. And most of what we can be taught like that. So you're like, oh, I get that. You could all now do that. 10 years from now, you will all still be able to do that. And we make things so much more complicated than they have to be. And the teachers do, but partly we make it more complicated because we're not listening, because we're busy writing stuff down. Just a total aside, one of the things I did learn in high school that's very meaningful to me, I had a great teacher, BC Calc. His name was Mr. Benson. And for a long time, I thought Mr. Benson was a complete flake, because he would sit up there at the board while he was teaching calc, and he would mutter to himself, and he would draw these funny little pictures. And I realized after a while that what he was doing is he was trying to figure out whether cosine at 0 was 1 or 0. And we do this all the time. He did several things like that. And I thought, my God, my BC Calc teacher's a moron. He can't remember the most basic stuff. And I finally, because I was like this, I was sort of obnoxious, I went and actually asked him about it. Like, what's wrong with you? I don't know, I thought he was drinking or something. And he said something with no shame, not even really realizing it was a problem, and it absolutely rocked me. And it's changed how I've approached a lot of things afterwards. I said, why can't you remember all of these sort of details about what you're trying to teach us? And he said, that's not really how I do it. I understand it, so I just figure it out again when I need to. And that made it was like, wow. Because if you're willing to really spend the time to understand something, and it turns out it takes less energy to understand something than to memorize all the facts, then you can actually rederive anything without having to keep it in your brain. So, that was another thing I remember learning in high school that changed how I was as a student. Yes.
How does artificial intelligence affect like future jobs and stuff?
That's a good question. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant and then I'll come back to that. I promise I'm going to. This is a roundabout answer to that. I have a massive issue with the whole like outsourcing is bad thing, and with, you know, computers are going to take your job. Jobs have been changing since there were jobs. And I understand that there are lots of people who end up in a job where they don't have training for something else, and they feel hosed. I get that. The right solution is not to save their job. The right solution, that is an inhumane solution, by the way, because what happens when you save somebody's job when their job really ought not to be saved is you make them feel small, because they know that they have a job that ought to go away, and that doesn't make anybody feel good. If we actually cared about the people whose jobs are going away, we would spend the money to train them. And yes, there are people who are they're not in a mode, let's say, because of how they grew up, because of their current age, whatever that is, they're not interested in learning something else. Those people I'm less sympathetic to. But anyone who's willing to learn, I think we should shovel money at them so that they can be retrained. I think that's the right answer. And I think instead of impeding jobs going away, we should accelerate jobs going away. We should celebrate the fact that whether it's someone in another country with a lower standard of living who can do what we otherwise would do for less pay, that's good. That gives us the opportunity to do something else. Now, it puts the pressure on us to not be lazy. You know, it should scare the living daylights out of everybody in this room that there are countries where people are willing to work when they're your age, 14 hours a day, indefinitely. Like, until their 50s. They think this is normal. I'm not kidding. 14 hours a day in China and India, they think this is normal. They're serious as a heart attack about doing it, and they will crush us because none of you are really going to work that hard for that long because we're too comfy as a society. Our only alternative is to happily let them have the jobs we currently have and to use the opportunity, the luxury that we have to be in this room and be thinking about this stuff, to be creative and to invent the next jobs. So how will artificial intelligence affect our jobs? If we focus on our jobs as they are today, it will crush and remove as many of them as it possibly can. Like, I don't know, baristas at Starbucks, I don't really see it 20 years from now. Like, I don't even really see it today. Phone booth operators, I mean, it's not even artificial intelligence. I don't really see that one either. And I'm not being mean to them. These are people who are good people who can handle their jobs. I'm just saying there's a lot of things that computers, if they can't already do them perfectly today, certainly will be able to in the near future. And there's lots of stuff that we don't even think of as being in the domain of computers. Witness the self-driving cars thing from Google, that are starting to become the domain of computers, or at least computers will do much of the underlying effort, and then people will do higher level activities. Remember, people used to count. That used to be what made you smart, is that you could do like long division and addition. This is what accountants did, right? Then we had calculators, but they still were basically like using graph paper to keep track of everything. Then they got spreadsheets. At no time in this process did they ever say things are getting better. Every single time this happened, people were like, oh God, we're going to lose our jobs, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. There was a massive movement when the calculator was invented to keep it out of schools. That seems ridiculous to us now. But the theory was that you all wouldn't learn math if we allowed you to have calculators. It's just dumb. But people resist this stuff, and in the same way, artificial intelligence is going to remove a lot of the lower level stuff in all of the different areas of our life. But for those people, and there's life beyond artificial intelligence, right? Like journalism is sort of an orthogonal issue. But for many of the technology-oriented jobs, those people who embrace it, who understand it, or can work side by side with it, are going to do great and are going to have better experiences. So an example that's happening in biology right now is that while there will probably always be some hypothesis-driven science, the way a lot of science, particularly biology, has worked for a long, long time, is that the processing of the data was relatively rudimentary, and what the magic was in getting the data, setting up the experiments right, deciding what to do, which means you had to form a hypothesis, and then you go test, you take the data, and you sort of see at a relatively simple level what the data was saying to you. That's changing. There's now more and more processing of the data that can go on, and people in the biology field are becoming more and more sophisticated, and what that's doing is moving hypothesis-driven science towards data-driven science, where people are willing to take these huge assays to ask very broad questions without knowing what the answer is because they have some reason to believe that there will be interesting things in there. Then they find patterns, essentially, using artificial intelligence or other tools that go by different names but work out to the same thing. And then once they find that pattern, then you have to essentially use that like your hypothesis and go back and take more data so you aren't overfitting to the data, but that's an example of how it's playing out in biology. Yes?
Before, whenever you were talking about chess, you were talking about how AI was going to help humanity and like help us think, right? Do you think it's possible for cybernetic augmentation of like artificial intelligence directly into human brain? And if that's possible, then how do you think that the three laws of Astro
I will re-ask that question. So the question was, number one, can artificial intelligence, or what are the chances that artificial intelligence could be not only augmenting us externally, but actually augmenting us internally in our brains? And if it does, then how would that relate possibly to the Asimov's three laws about robotics and about how robots should behave? So there's a whole bunch of stuff buried in that question. Let's unpack it just a tiny bit. The first thing is, computers can augment us without being implanted into our brains. So I think it's very possible that in lots of ways, computers will become even more a lever for our mind than they are right now, without us having to open up our brains. And personally, I guess there are things that I would be willing to sort of allow something to penetrate my skull in order to get those abilities, like, I don't know, flying or something, but it'd have to be close to flying before I'd be willing to let somebody drill into my skull. So, I believe that it will probably happen at some point, but I don't think that's a super near-term kind of thing. Part of the problem is, we don't understand the human brain. The human brain is not designed to be understood. And so it's a pretty cool computing machine, but that doesn't make it easy to sort of reverse engineer. And until we can do that, the abstract interface that you need between the human and the computer is not necessarily done at the neuron level. So that's part of the challenge too. I think that there's still a bigger question about how we apply notions of liability to computers as they're allowed to do more and more. So if we let computers do things that people used to do, and we used to tell somebody, you're a bad person if you do it wrong, in the way you don't like it, and now the computer's doing it, who's at fault? Is it the person who was using that computer when the computer did that thing? Or who asked the computer to solve the problem in the first place? Or the person who programmed the computer? I don't have an answer to that. I guarantee you that that will become a massive issue in our society, though, and that we will spend probably 50 years coming to conclusions about where that falls. And it will meaningfully impact how these things are rolled out in our society, because to the extent that it is the developer of the system that is at fault, then that will cause big bloating of that piece of the insurance industry, and people will simply put in less capability, or capabilities that aren't closed loop. So you can imagine, it's like, would you like me to fly the plane for you? But you have to like push the button every like 2 minutes to get it to keep flying the plane. And he's like, yes, I still want you to fly the plane. You know, just so it's like, well, he was flying the plane because he was pushing the button. It's retarded, but you know, that's the way it's going to be until we solve these liability problems. Yes?
before you were talking about, you know, how you can't hire jerks in an organization, but like...
You can, you shouldn't.
You shouldn't, yeah. But there's like a lot of jerks out there, so how do you recommend dealing with jerks if you have to deal with someone, you know?
Okay, the question is, how do you deal with jerks? Right, so let's say, you know, you're building an organization and you manage to hire no jerks. But you have to go out and talk to other organizations that weren't as smart or as fortunate as you to be jerk-free organizations. Right? So you end up having to talk to people who are under-enlightened, let's say. So everybody has their own way of doing it, and I'm not really going to suggest that this is the best way to do it. I'll tell you how I deal with it. I'm sort of, the louder you get, the quieter I get, and the more jerky you get, the more I will essentially be soft and Socratic, I'll be specific about that, hoping that you either can come to the conclusion that you're a jerk, or if you can't, then I basically insulted you in a way that will pass over your head, and I at least get the catharsis of having insulted you without having to pay the price for having sort of made our relationship worse. It's like, so you think poking her in the eye is a good way to do business? Okay, that's interesting. Can you help me understand a little bit about, I'm interested, because maybe I should be poking my employees in the eye. I just saw you poke her in the eye. Can you help me understand how that was helpful? Maybe I'm missing something here, right? And then you're either going to be like, I don't know, I like poking her in the eye. And then, right, so I insulted you and you didn't even notice. Or you can be like, well, all right, that was a mistake, whatever. I'll say sorry to her later. You're still going to be a jerk tomorrow, but at least we, like, amped your jerkiness down for the day or something, right? Different people yell and scream at the jerks, and I don't think that works very well. I think that's a good way to get them to be jerkier. Yes?
With respect to machine learning, what is intelligence learning?
That's a good question. I'll give you a couple different answers. So somehow, I'm not sure exactly how it happened. The only thing that I'm somewhat routinely quoted for is the answer to that question. I wrote an op-ed piece a long time ago in the New York Times, the first sentence of which was that an operative definition of artificial intelligence was how to get computers to do the things they do in the movies. And I was sort of being cute, but that seems to have semi-stuck. I don't know that it's the best definition, though. I'll tell you the one that I liked best, which was from a man named Herb Simon, who really helped to build Carnegie Mellon, won a Nobel Prize in economics, really helped start the field of artificial intelligence. And his definition was, artificial intelligence is the process of trying to get computers to do the things that, when done by a person, are called intelligent. And he said that on purpose, because what tends to happen is that as soon as you get a computer to do it, then it's like the Pee Wee Herman of, like, I meant to do that. You know, just people are like, well, that's not intelligent. What do you mean it's not intelligent? Well, a computer can do it. Right? It's like the finish line is receding as you're running the race. It's not really a fun game to play, right? So you, as a scientist, you have to fight back against that and redefine it so you have some chance of crossing the finish line, at least occasionally. And that does tend to happen, right? When computers beat chess, all of a sudden chess stopped seeming like a good definition of being super smart. Obviously, it's still an interesting game for us to play, but it really has taken on a different status in our society than it used to take on. And that's because computers are better at it than us. In the same way that adding and remembering are no longer as impressive as they used to be, because computers are better than those things than we are. So I think that there are lots of challenges still in front of computers, things that clearly they aren't as good at people at, reasoning by analogy, for example. But we can point at lots of tasks, specific tasks, or very general things like reasoning by analogy and say, here's something people are good at and that the computers are bad at, and so it's the task of artificial intelligence to try to get computers in that domain or in that sort of skill set up to that level or above that level of skill, and that's why I like Herb Simon's answer. Yes? That's a good question. The question was, now that I'm at Google, do I find myself innovating less and doing more directing of other people while I'm like kind of watching them innovate? So the first answer is, in a way, this is the fewest people I've had reporting to me in a long time because I've been running other businesses. So even though Google's a larger organization, I'm in a way more focused on the innovation. I don't have to go raise money from venture capitalists or that kind of thing. So in a way, I'm actually more focused on innovation than I used to be. But let me answer the question differently, because I watch people go through this process all the time. Very talented technical people get to this place in their career, usually after they've been in the workforce for maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years, where they realize that they're going to hit a bit of a glass ceiling if they just stay technical. And they want to advance in their careers, but they have very different feelings, depending on who it is, about how much they want to be doing the kind of thing that they're doing. They want to get better at it, they want to get more rewarded for it, but not all of them want to manage people. And so the analogy that I give, the Archimedes said, if you give me a lever long enough, I'll move the world. So I use the analogy of that boulder that you're going to move with the lever. The question is, how much do you want to be touching the boulder and deeply understand the boulder, and how much can you stand to be far away from the boulder? The farther you are from the boulder, the longer a lever you can use, the bigger a boulder you can move. Different people have very different comfort levels, and I think that that's a very good abstract way to think about how far from the boulder do I want to stand. Some people don't mind standing, essentially 5 reports from the boulder. If you have 4 people working for you, you're still a small team. You can see the boulder. It's like arm's length away, even though you've got a little bit of a lever there, right? If you have 50 people, you're pretty far from the boulder. You can't really see the nooks and crannies on the boulder anymore. And if you're running a 20,000 person organization, you definitely can't see the boulder anymore. And different people have different skill sets that can prevent them from getting too close to the boulder or too far away from the boulder, and different emotional preferences about what makes them feel good. So I have found that I like knowing enough about the boulder to be dangerous. So I basically let go of the lever sometimes, and I walk over and just check the boulder out, so that later, when I stand back a little bit and I'm holding the lever, I can talk to people about the boulder. And I don't really know as much about the boulder as they do, but it feels like I do, if you aren't looking too close or listening too carefully. And that makes them feel good and it makes me more productive. But I still do like having the lever because that's where I think I'm more effective. Yes?
I like how you talk about the advantages of listening versus note-taking. How do you think we can implement more active listening in high schools versus note-taking?
Well, I'll give you an example. How many assemblies have you been to like this, where you guys got to drive what we were talking about? Not that many, I'm willing to bet. I don't know why. It's your time. So, one of the things, if I ran the zoo, is I would suggest that you guys get to spend more of the time setting the agenda. Because if you ask the question, at least you, guaranteed, there's one person in this room who's going to really listen to this answer. There's no doubt you're not going to doze off while I'm talking to you, because you asked the question, you definitely want to know the answer. Whereas if I decide what I'm going to talk to you about, it's possible nobody here is interested. And you're not a bad surrogate for everybody here. You're a much better surrogate for what they care about, what you all collectively care about, than me guessing what you care about. Or God knows, than letting, the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, decide what you should learn, right? So that's an example where I think, especially for a group like this, and I can see that there are some students for whom letting them set the agenda may not be the right thing, but this is sort of the poster child crowd for the people who should get to set their own agenda as much as it is humanly possible, and I think this is an example of that. I think everything, this is what I was saying before, the hard stuff is actually getting an organization to do something. And I don't just mean managing an organization, I mean just being any part of the organization is hard. So you get most of your work, even now, even for you guys, I bet more than half of your work you do by yourself. I don't do any work by myself. I don't know anyone my age who does any work by themselves. So why are you being trained to do any work by yourselves? So another thing that I would do is I would give little known projects, even if we already know that it's possible, to 20 of you and give you 5 or 6 months to get it done. And then of course it would turn out you don't know how to do it. And then you would come and ask your teachers for help and education and books. And then you would feel much more ownership over that process. And you would learn way more than you do right now. There are also things, just side rants, but there are things that tend not to get pushed, like public speaking. So working in teams is one, but public speaking is another. Where there's like this vague thing floating in the background, like maybe you could join the debate team if you happen to be one of those people who's into that. Instead of like, this is a basic life skill, like being able to read, right? Because you will all have to talk to other people. Sometimes it'll be groups of 5 people, sometimes groups of 5,000, but it doesn't really matter, it's actually the same skill. And yet you don't get a lot of training in that. It's okay, and there are times and places you can pick it up afterwards, but again, if I ran the zoo, that's some of the stuff. You know, interviewing. Here's a total side rant. I had this funny experience just a couple days ago. So, I was in San Francisco at a place called Mission Cliffs, and I was belaying, top roping, so I was sort of holding a rope, and my 6.5-year-old son was 40 feet up the wall, sort of climbing up it, and you don't have to pay that much attention to like he can fall or anything because I'm holding the rope. I was just kind of looking around, and we were up on the sort of kiddie wall, so it only went about 30 feet up, but sort of off the cliff, it was like down and then went back up maybe 60, 80 feet, something like that. And so what was only about 10 or 15 feet higher than me, but was actually 40, 50 feet up, there was this woman climbing. And she just had one of these rare looks on her face. She was just fierce and powerful and confident and relaxed. She was absolutely glowing. And I looked at her, and at first I thought it was just that she was glowing. And then I was like, God, she looks so familiar. And then I realized, literally, and it took me like 10 seconds, and she looked at me, and we had this moment where neither of us recognized each other. And then I realized, because she was like, oh, she started waving with one of her hands, which was hanging off this overhang, that literally, the day before, she'd been sitting in front of me at Google interviewing. And I did not recognize her, because that face is not what she brought to that interview. She did fine at the interview, but she was in a business suit, she was a little nervous, she was very put together, you don't swear at an interview, you don't know exactly what's expected of you because you don't get any training on interviewing. And you know what? She acquitted herself very well at the interview, but it was nothing compared to the look on her face. I would have hired her in a heartbeat for that look on her face, because those are the people who are going to run the world, who are going to figure out a way to solve problems. And I didn't get a chance to talk to her again. I probably should, now I'm thinking about it. But, you all could learn that, because you all have that face inside you, but you don't know how to bring it out, because you don't feel comfortable bringing it out. Because you're nervous, you're not sure if it's appropriate. It's hard to learn how to summon that feeling, because you haven't touched it that often yet. But you have that feeling inside you, and a lot of what's going to cause you to be successful in life is just losing the fear. Who cares what they think? That's me. I'm going to go get it done. And when you glow like that, people will smell it, and everything else will just melt away. It really won't matter. And I wish they would teach that in high school, too. Yes?
You mentioned public speaking, and, as advisors, sometimes it's a lot easier when we have students who are really strong in math and love math or computer programming, some technical like engineering. But in your industry, what about people whose strengths and interests is more verbal? Is there a place, and given people like that in terms of majors, how much math should they still take, what industry?
So, I mean, I'm biased. Like, I can't imagine trying to go through life, given the world as it is now and the age you currently are, without knowing calculus and a couple, and 1 year of programming. Like, I would recommend not trying to do that. That does not mean you have to be a world expert at it. It's okay, and you'll forget a lot of it later, but to be a little conversant in it would be a good thing. And to not be afraid of the conversations and the people that you're going to end up talking with. But beyond that, it really doesn't matter. Because there are people who, the world is about learning how to learn. That's actually what matters. And so whether you do journalism or English or biology, it makes no difference. And you can go to med school after having done violin at Juilliard, and people do that. That's fine. Because if you work hard enough to do well at violin at Juilliard, you're going to do great in med school. It's just the way it is, and that's, I think, actually get in. Music is like one of the highest percentages that they let in because they figure that it's important. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think it really matters what you pick. I think it matters how you pick it, right? Like this. It matters how you think about it, and it matters whether you've trained yourself in these meta skills, whether you can let yourself go, whether you can approach life fiercely or with fears. If you do it fiercely, then you know what? If you start from an English perspective, let's say, and you become a marketing person, that's fine. You can end up, having a massive impact in government, in nonprofit, in industry. Those people run companies or run big parts of companies as much as people who are technical do.
You work for Google and you're like the director of the program, so what exactly do they ask you to innovate or invent at Google?
Well, so the question is, what are they looking for at Google? Again, I don't speak for Google, and Google's doing a lot of things, but there's a lot I can't talk about, obviously, but generally, that's my task, is to help Google. I'm not the only one who's tasked with that. I have a co-director and lots of smart people at Google, but generally my task is to go try to find new things that would be powerful to do. Again, not the only one who's doing that. Look, I have about a minute left, so all right, I'll take one last question. I can't help myself. It's like a personality test. So the answer is, for a long time I was PC, though I didn't like it. I don't mean politically correct, I mean I used a Windows machine. Because what I care about is that it doesn't break and that it's interoperable. Because I just want a tool for my mind so I can do other things. I don't have a religious conviction, or anyway, I didn't have a religious conviction about these things. So I was PC for a long time because that's what we had at several of my previous companies, and because it's more interoperable. Eventually, my CTO at my hedge fund caused us to be on Mac, which I was like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to fight it, you support it. Now I adore Macs, and for the very simple reason, they don't crash. And I appreciate that when I want to use my computer, it's not busy doing its own special thing, that it's like, let's do my thing. I like that about computers, when they want to do my thing instead of their thing for 20 minutes with a blue screen. All right, so I'll be around for another 15 minutes if you guys want to chat some more. Thank you very much for coming.